So you've had, I mean, you've been, and I'm the same way, dude. I'm like a big supporter. I'm not going to say that I'm an advocate or what do they call it? Not an activist.
Yeah.
I'm an advocate, but I'm not an activist. I'm not out like waving marijuana flags and smoking joints in front of fucking congressmen and shit. But I'm a huge supporter and fan of like legalizing.
I have to be neutral.
Why?
Because, you know, like society told me, like my parents growing up in Utah, of course, Christian-based religion in Utah is big. I think like almost half of the state is LDS.
60, I think it's 65% of Utah total.
Yeah, I'm not sure
Cumulatively.
exactly.
The only reason I know that is because I watched a National Geographic show the other day called Drugs, Inc., and it was on the heroin and opiate epidemic in Utah. Oh, yeah. And they said it was, I think it was 61 or 63% of Utah's LDS. Wow. Mormon.
Okay. So I'm going to have to watch that.
It's good. But I wasn't even planning on it. I just literally sat down. I was eating some dinner. I pop on the tube for, 20 minutes to like just relax.
Yeah.
And Brent, like new episode, Drugs, Inc. And the opening scene is the temple with the tabernacle saying angels and stuff, and I'm like, no shit. Yep. And then it's like Salt Lake City, and then it goes right into this scene of these kids using heroin, and and it was an hour-long program on the epidemic of heroin and everything here in Utah.
Okay. Well, like I'm pretty versed in that. I mean, and I'm one of those. I'm one of those that got prescribed pain pills and turned to heroin. But outside of that, like part of the reason, like society tells us drugs are bad, and as a child growing up in Utah, drugs was marijuana. Like it was out of my mind completely of the illicit drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, those things. Like, I'd never seen those. I didn't know people that did that, And I didn't grow up in a sheltered home either. I have family members, and my dad keeps in touch with all of the family. So we would visit family driving back to Illinois where our family farm is, and we would visit the ones that were living in trailers, drinking themselves to death, and we loved them just as much as we loved the husband and wife Baptist ministers. It's like the same thing. So I grew up in a really open-minded family, but drugs were bad, and drugs are marijuana. A drug dealer is some guy from Compton.
Thug.
And that was not my opinion, but that's what was taught to me. That was what was perceived. And then at like 15, 16 years old, the first time I spark a joint, I'm with my two friends. And what we're doing is trying to increase the fun. And there was little to no negative consequences. Not saying that there can't be negative consequences, because, I mean, people get drunk for the first time, drive, and kill people. That does happen.
Yeah.
But more often than not, that first couple of times, there's no consequences. So I was told these are bad, you'll do crazy stuff. People get killed. Marijuana scrambles your brain. The DARE program tells you just say no. And like that's what I saw. And then all of a sudden I smoked a joint with my friends, and we laughed, and we ate a whole shitload of Cheetos. And I tell that to 2,200 high school students, and I get the laugh.
Yeah.
It's the same situation. But here's the thing. Nobody said, hey, Court, you have a lot of addiction in your family, close family, relatives. Your chances are more than likely that you possibly have the disease of addiction and alcoholism inherent in your personality. So if you do decide to smoke that joint, it may affect you differently than other people. It may be so elusive that you once again have to do it, and once again have to do it, and then shortly thereafter, you're not going to be able to. You're not going to be able to stop or limit the amount. You're going to try and control and enjoy it, and you're going to lose everything from it. Oh, by the way, like 2 years out of high school, you're going to die in a trailer of a heroin overdose. And I would have been, no, this is just pot. I'm just having fun with my friends. So there was no education there. Like I didn't get an education from DARE. I didn't get an education from law enforcement, and I didn't get an education from my family. It was just, no, it was bad.
It was bad.
And alcohol was bad until you turned 21. But yet I saw my dad drink it with impunity. But when you talk about somebody who has the disease of addiction, that's kind of the obsession of the alcoholic and the drug addict, is that they can control and enjoy it. See, and I couldn't control and enjoy it. From that first time, I smoked a joint, and I didn't even like it, but like it was okay, it was fun, but I thought I was fitting in. I thought I was doing what was cool. Plus, it felt cool to do something bad and get away with it. So all of a sudden, I had to lead this double life. So I knew I was responsible for going to school, being there on time, and not leaving before the school day was over. So like, school is most important. Like, I don't care if you do shitty, as long as you show up and do your best, even if your best is shit. Like, I don't care. And don't lie to me. And then that's how I was raised. Work the hardest.
But yeah, you're lying.
Yeah.
The whole time. But my kids the same thing. That's what scares me about being a dad, is I'm like,
oh yeah,
don't lie to me. And the same thing my parents did. And I lied like a motherfucker.
But I had to lead a double life.
Yeah.
So I had to still continue to control and enjoy. Slowly drinking came in, smoking weed, and then it was like, oh, well, we got these drunk pills, and turns out there were benzodiazepines, like Klonopin, Xanax, which is a central nervous system depressant, so it has the same effect as alcohol. So it's like the pill form of alcohol. So I take, we call these drunk pills, and you take them, it lowers your inhibitions, you feel like you're drunk, and it's like, okay, well, pretty soon it was like taking one of those, and then it was taking like two of those, and then it was taking like four of those, and then incorporating alcohol, and then taking a hit off the joint. And then it was like, okay, well, now we got to get back to school. And like that eventually spiraled out of control right after high school. But leading the double life was the hard part for me, because I knew my parents expected me to go to school and do my best. So I had to continue to do that. Plus, I loved martial arts. I'd been in martial arts in some form of combative sports since the age of like 6 or 7. I'm not sure when I started, but it was like 6 or 7 years old in this karate. One of the instructors did kickboxing. He did jiu-jitsu, and he was a state placer in the high school wrestling program. He took second in state, so folk style wrestling. And so he was like, man, you're really talented at this. You're really good at this stuff. You should take it to the next level, man. You should start learning jiu-jitsu, and you should join a wrestling club. And so my dad and him talked, and they got me into a wrestling club, and I started wrestling. And like, that's where that started. But so I focused on athletics. I focused on, I saw a documentary on this MMA fighter guy, and I was like, that's what I want to do. So I'm going to wrestle. I'm going to do some boxing, some kickboxing, some this jiu-jitsu stuff, maybe judo. I'm going to wrestle and take it as far as I can. And then I'm going to try and pursue a career in mixed martial arts. And that's what my thought was when I was a young kid. That's what I was going to do. I had one traumatic incident happen. I got left by accident with some cousins of mine at Lagoon, this amusement park. And I got separated from the group, and I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I was left with some older cousins, and I hid behind this garbage can for like 8 or 9, 10 hours.
No shit.
And I got super sick, and like I had a lot of emotional problems and separation anxiety, fear of crowds, fear of school, fear. So the martial arts kind of helped with that, and I focused on that. And but here's the thing, it's like in that early like teenage years, you're in a time in your life where like friends are kind of the most important thing. Being accepted is important, but also to appeasing my parents was important. And so leading that double life got harder and harder and harder as high school was ending, and maybe possible career decisions, college decisions, wrestling in college. And when I left high school, I graduated with honors, and I did really well. Partly because I was good at cheating, because I was dyslexic. I'm dyslexic, and I never read a book cover to cover till I was 25. But yet, I managed to make it out of high school with honors, and not missing any school. But that double life got harder and harder to live, because the drugs and alcohol took more of a role in my life. So, and then once I got injured right out of high school, I was heading over to my girlfriend's house in the middle of the night, drunk, and I got into an accident, shattered my collarbone. And a couple years earlier, I tore off a growth plate in my left elbow, arm wrestling. And so I got that fixed. I got my collarbone fixed, and they prescribed me a bunch of pain pills. and I was already drinking. I was in my first year of college. I wasn't wrestling. I lost my scholarship because of Title IX, the Women's and Men's Fairness in Sports, and there was no colleges in Utah that had a wrestling team. And so I had no idea what I was doing, and I was miserable, and I knew I was having a challenging time in school. I couldn't get through the literature. I couldn't read very well. I was just like, shit, man, I can't cheat my way through this. And you take a couple of Percocet and you drink a couple of beers, guess what? You're like, you know what? Fuck it, man. It's okay. I'll be all right. You know, I'm okay. And that just spiraled out of control. And I mean, I'm talking somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20 to 40 arrests over the next 2 years. I mean, some gnarly charges, you know, inciting a riot, criminal mischief, felony this, felony that, DUIs. And I just couldn't get on top of it. And then inevitably I ended up dropping out of high school. Okay, well, I'm going to go to work. And I was working at Sam's Club so I could go to college, and I hated the job, you know, and like drugs took a bigger role. There was a guy that worked with me, and he was a former cocaine addict. He used to smoke crack, and I had an opportunity to buy my first 8-ball of cocaine, and I was like, perfect, I'll sell this to my boss because that's what a good employee does. Like, I was confused at the time, you know, and it's like, well, I did that, but he only wanted half, and so I was stuck with the other half. And so I went into the bathroom, I snorted a little line of cocaine, because I'd already been snorting pills. I thought, you know, I'll just take it to the next level. I snorted the line of cocaine. I walked out of the bathroom, and I'm like, maybe I'll snort one more line of cocaine. So I went back into the bathroom. I snorted a line of cocaine. I came back out, started to work. I'll do another line of cocaine. And then I went back out, and I'm like, man, this feels really good. You know, I feel really active. And, man, I'm getting a lot of work done. And I'm go back to the bathroom, and then like 30 trips back and forth from the bathroom, you know, I did like $150 worth of cocaine in like 2 hours. And I unloaded more pallets than anybody ever in the history of Sam's Club. And I thought, this isn't bad. Man, I got all my work done. I was focused. I feel happy.
Dude, I'm
really
employee
good.
of the fucking month.
Yeah, woo, woo. And then I came down from it. And then went a 2-month duration of doing lots and lots of cocaine, spending every dime I had, trying to figure out how to get more cocaine, which led into selling marijuana, which I thought, well, I don't like smoking marijuana, so at least I'll be selling it, and, you know, it's like whatever, and I could, you know, but I couldn't manage that, maintain that, and the day before I got fired, I left, and then I hired on at another company doing landscaping, and I was loaded the whole time working for him, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, somebody was like, man, this guy's working really good. He was a friend of the company owner, and he said, hey, I've got this excavation company that I work for, and I think you'd be a good hire. We start at this wage, and it was like twice what I was making. And he's like, we drug test, and and I'm like, oh, I got to stop. And so I detoxed in my home, my mom and dad's house, for like 2 or 3 days. It was the worst 2 or 3 days of my life. And I stayed sober for about 2 weeks, and I got that job, and I worked hard, you know, like 4 or 5 days on the job. This guy came up to me, and he was like, hey, you know, like, you're really good. You can go places in this company. It's the best I'd felt because I had 2 years of misery before that. You know, not having a career, not finishing college, not wrestling in college, not pursuing anything other than just getting loaded and then thinking I was going to figure out how life was going to work. But first I had to get loaded to figure it out. And I got sober, and I felt better than I had ever felt. And I was working hard. I was making paychecks. I was doing really good. And I got a call from a friend of mine growing up. And he said, my girlfriend just had a baby. I have some Percocet. Do you want them? And I'm like, no, dude. I said, I haven't even drank, man. 2 weeks. I haven't used. I haven't drank. I feel good. I just got a job. I ended up getting like a couple $1 an hour raise. I was working like 60 hours a week, dude. I was making $700, $800, $900 a week. Like I felt good. I was 19 years old, and I'm like, damn, dude, this is great. And I got off work. And on the way home from work, I called that guy frantically. Hey, do you got a couple of those? I talked myself into taking them because I'd ran like a jackhammer for a couple hours. And I was sore. And I'm like, if I take just 2 of these Percocet, you know, help me sleep, I'll feel good. So he's like, yep, I got a couple of those. So I went and I took them. And 4 months later, I lost that job. I got kicked out of the apartment I was in. I got kicked out of my home. I was homeless. And I went from cocaine, pain pills, benzos, a little bit of marijuana, drinking, to heroin. I walked into a friend's house, and he said, I noticed he was shooting up. And I was like, man, what are you doing? He said, dude, this is way better than Oxycontin. He said, it cost me $10 for a balloon. And I can shoot up 10 or 11 times of this. It keeps me high all day long. And he said, I just used a little bit at a time. And I'm like, I think I want to do it. He's like, nah, man, just try snorting it first. He said, it's pretty powerful. And so I was like, all right. So I took in a little air solution bottle, mixed it up. It was a little black tar heroin, and I snorted it for a couple of weeks. And I didn't really like it. And a couple of weeks into it, I decided I was going to shoot up. So I was in this dude's basement, and I sat down. He strapped up a belt. I remember the vein he went in, and he just shot up this tiny little bit, dude, and it hit me. My eyes rolled back in my head. 2 tears rolled out of my eyes and hit my earlobes, and I just went, whoa. And then all of a sudden, the disappointment in my father's eyes went away. The disappointment of not completing college went away. The fear of not finding a career, the fear of possibly screwing up the possible career I was in excavation, all of that went away. And at that time, my girlfriend, who I'd been with since I was about 15 or 16, she had left me. She moved to Russia to teach English. She's like, I'm done with your shit. I'd been arrested. I had tons of charges. I couldn't function. And that heroin took all that away. And I fell in love with heroin. I said, as long as I got this, I'll be fine. So I left with my little balloon of heroin, and 20 minutes later, I begged $20 or $30 off my mom. Oh, I need gas money or whatever bullshit. I wasn't allowed at their house, but if I needed something, they would help me. So they, gave me $30 or $40, and I went straight back, dude, and bought a couple of balloons of heroin, and I was like, as long as I got this, I'm okay. And I got to the point where I was probably shooting up like 15, 20, 30 times a day, just periodically. And I was doing it in my ankles. I was doing it in my neck so I wouldn't have track marks, because I was still trying to manage and maintain that job. And one day, the party went on a little bit too long. It was time to get to work. And I was exhausted. I drove myself to work. I got about 50 miles away from my home, almost onto the job site, and I called my boss, and I made up some story about some bullshit that happened the night before. Can I take a day off? I'll be back tomorrow. And he said, yeah, you better take the day off. And I was like, oh, thank God, I'm just going to get some sleep. Everything will be okay. And then I drove back home, and right before I got home, this light turned red. And I was almost to the intersection, and I'm like, I can shoot the gap. I'm almost home. And I was nodding in and off, and I was just in a bad spot. And I made it almost halfway through the intersection, and I looked to my right, and there was a car just right there. Boom. They had a green light. They hit the right rear of my little 99 Jeep, 2-door Jeep Cherokee. Just nicked the right rear of mine. And then I rolled and on my roof, and I slid 400 or 500 feet, kicked the door, got out, and just went, fuck, I can't do this anymore. And thank God that girl wasn't hurt, but nothing came of it other than I went to the hospital. My parents drove me to the hospital. I was okay. I was coherent. She was okay. I went to the hospital. They asked for drug tests. My parents asked for drug tests. The police asked for drug tests, but because of HIPAA, they couldn't take them. But I tested positive for everything. I mean, you name it, it was on there, other than maybe psilocybin or acid, But outside of that, I had everything. I had amphetamines, cocaine, tested positive for benzos, for marijuana, for alcohol. I mean, heroin, you name it, I had it in my system. And I ended up showing up to work 2 or 3 days later, and I told the guy, hey, I got into an accident. I rolled my Jeep. It's going to be challenging, but I can make it to work. I can ride the bus. I can do whatever. And I said, but I think I got a problem with alcohol. I didn't tell him about the drugs, but I said alcohol. And he said, we don't have a place for you here. If you get sober, you're more than welcome to come back. You're a great employee, but we don't have room for somebody with a problem with alcohol. Get that figured out, come back, and you've got a job. And it was the first job I ever lost. And then Chelsea left, a couple of days later, and I was done. So that heroin took all that pain away. And then I'm not sure how long later, but I'm not sure when I lost the job, but it had to have been a month or two later. I got kicked out of the apartment I was in. I got into a fight with a friend of mine. We were boxing. And I got kicked out. I had nowhere to live, and no place to sleep for like 3 or 4 weeks. And that was like October or September. And September 9th rolled around. It was a Sunday. I'd called around. I had a friend that I used to teach karate to his kids, and he owned a landscaping business. And I said, hey, man, do you got a part-time job just till winter, maybe snow removal, that I could pick up and make a little side money? And he said, yeah, I can hire you. So I started working for him, and I just increasingly got worse, shooting up every day. And I was like, as long as I don't go to anything else or don't, I'll be fine. I still drank, but I was just shooting up. And then September 9th, it was Sunday. I was in this trailer. My cousin, she allowed me to move in as long as there was no drugs involved. And she was sober at the time. She was a former meth addict, but had completely sobered up and was doing really well. And she said, you can come in as long as you don't drink or use, and nobody's allowed in the house. And I had a girl over that night, and still to this day, I don't know who she is, but I had a girl over. We were just talking. And I was like, hey, I got to go to the bathroom. So I went in the bathroom, and I was do a little shot. And I did. I mixed up my shot. I had my glass case, and I had my kit, my spoon, and my syringe, and my cotton, and everything in there, my little kit. And I mixed up a shot, closed my glass case, put it on the counter, sat down on the toilet, and then I shot up. And immediately after I shot up, I got really sweaty, and I just went, oh, fuck. Because I never used to shoot up enough to nod off. It was just enough to get a little bump. Because I would do it at work. I would do it, wherever. And I had enough left over for the next morning and the next day. So I was like, I don't know, maybe it had some fentanyl in it. I don't know. Maybe it was a little bit more pure than the other shit. But either way, it was just enough to put me over the edge. And then I shot up. I got sweaty, and I just went, oh, shit. And just boom. And I fell down. And I didn't find out what happened until about 4.5 or 5 years later, after winning the Ultimate Fighter, and ESPN did a Sports Center piece, and they found the EMTs that worked on me. They found the doctor that worked on me. There was a licensed clinical social worker that met me at the hospital after I came out of the coma. My mom, who's a nurse, she was an ER nurse for a long time. She was a charge nurse. She told me a bunch of times, oh, you died, like, how much more do you have to go through, and I mean, of course, moms are irate, so I didn't necessarily believe her, but when I woke up out of the coma, like, I thought I'd gotten to an accident, and I didn't really know where I was at or what had happened, but my chest was in excruciating pain. I felt horrible, and, I mean, I had IVs, I had tubes hanging in out of me, and, like, I was like, fuck, man, I got to get to work. And, like, the first person I saw was my dad. And he was like, I don't think you need to worry about that. And I was just like, what the hell? And they had a friend. They had contacted a longtime friend of mine. And we got in an argument when we were like 13 or 14 over these girls or something like that. And I thought that we were still in an argument from 6 or 7 years earlier. And I'm like, screw you, man. He's like, what the hell is this guy talking about, And he's like, well, I don't know what to tell him. He's out of it. And I'd been in a coma for 5 or 6 days, so I didn't know where I was at or what had happened. And my chest pain came from the CPR and the defibrillations they did. So they broke my ribs, they broke my sternum, a lot of ribs. They do a lot of damage when people do CPR. I mean, I'm sure somebody's an EMT that's listening to this, it's like, that shit is violent. It is not. You're trying to get oxygen to the brain no matter what. That's the whole point, so I don't experience brain death. And they did CPR for like 14 or 15 minutes off and on because they would get a response and they'd lose me. They did defibrillations. But what happened is after the overdose, somebody had called 911. The ambulance showed up, but this guy that was a friend of my cousin who – she was like, we got to start CPR. And he was CPR certified, so he started CPR from my understanding. And then they got there within 2 or 3 minutes, and there was an ambulance that was like right next to the trailer park we were at. They pulled in, they started CPR. They took me out. I went to the hospital, but they did CPR for like 15 or 16 minutes. And there was a narcotics officer that got the call. He showed up, and by chance, he ended up finding the syringe in between the linoleum and the wall. I guess it had fallen behind the toilet in between the linoleum and the wall. It wasn't like finished well. And so that syringe was sitting there, and he snooped around, and my glass case had fallen off into the garbage can that had the heroin, had my spoon, had all that shit in it. And so he found that, and he called, and he said, hey, it's a heroin overdose. And so they administered Narcolone, reversed the effect, and then they induced me into a coma. So after coming out of that, I talked to basically a role model with the solution. A guy had 20 years of sobriety and was a former heroin addict. Also, too, had went back to school and became a licensed clinical social worker, kind of specializing in drug addiction. And he'd worked for treatment centers. He'd moved from Southern California to like Park City, Utah, and he got the call. And when I came out of the coma, he came to the hospital, retired, came to the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning to talk to me, to talk to a drug addict who had just come out of a fucking coma. And I mean, unselfishly, no profit motive, just came there to talk to me. And he drove like 40 or 50 miles from Park City all the way to Davis, like Layton, Utah. And, you know, it's 40 or 50 miles away in the middle of the goddamn night, 60 years old, married, trying to be retired, decided to come talk to a drug addict, heroin addict who had just overdosed. And after 5 minutes, I knew that dude knew where I had been. I talked a little bit about what society said, like the just say no. Like, you don't think I thought about that after shooting up 40 times a day? I didn't want to live like that. I wanted to quit, and I had tried to quit. The best I could do was 2 weeks on my own. And this dude knew where I had been and offered me a solution. He was cool, he was calm, and he knew where I'd been. It's like I was stuck in this hole, right? And my dad was like, here, son, let me help you out. But he couldn't help me out. Law enforcement, they threw charges on me. They arrested me. They put me in jail. You know, it sobered me up for a little bit, but as soon as I got back, I would get loaded because I thought that was my solution. And so it's like them offering their hand down to me, but they couldn't pull me out of this hole. I went to an outpatient treatment center for 5 months, and I didn't remember any of this. Like, my family had to tell me this. I must have lost it somewhere in the fog of drugs and alcohol. But I lost that memory of doing that, but I made it through that successfully. And so I don't know what had happened there. Like, that guy couldn't help me out. But this guy, Patrick Mahoney, freaking like climbed down in the hole and was like, hey, son, let's get out of this shit together. And then we climbed out together. He offered me a solution. He said, listen, you're going to start calling me every day. And he said, later on, we can work together maybe professionally because I specialize in this stuff, but you need to go to drug treatment. You need like 30 days of where you don't have any drugs or alcohol in your system. And then if you get a chance, maybe you should attend some 12-step meetings or some sort of recovery group. So that way when you get out of there, you have people surrounding you that are like me in long-term recovery. Because I didn't believe that he had 20 years sober. I listened to him, but I didn't think that was possible. I thought if anybody had been through what I had been through, you had to use. I thought it was a normal thing. I thought if you were happy, it was because you figured out how to use your Oxycontin more efficiently than me. Not that you were genuinely happy, you know? And so, like, that's where I was at. And so I went to that treatment, and I experienced 3 relapses. So when I was in the treatment center, there was a psych division or like a portion that was all for psych. And there was a guy in there, and those guys had meds, but we didn't. We were completely sober. And so this dude cheeked like a Percocet and gave it to me, and I crushed it up and snorted it like 2 weeks into that thing. Without even thinking, I just did it. Like, he handed it to me. Next thing I know, I was crushing it up, and I snorted it. And then I went, oh, shit. I can't do this. I can't. And so I told on myself to the guy who ran the place, this Dr. Schroeder guy. I was like, hey, man, listen, dude, like he ran the treatment center. I said, I can't leave here. If I leave here, I'm going to die, man. I want to be here, but I used. Somebody gave me a pill and I used it. And he was like, all right, you just got to tell everybody in your group that you relapsed, and ask for their forgiveness. And so that's what I did. And then I started over. I was like, okay, I'll do pretty good. And I stayed there for another like 15 or 20 days. Then I got out. 3 days after, we were doing like a sober event. And while I was in there, they did a bunch of testing. And I got tested for ADHD, which I had never been tested for ADHD, but my parents thought I had ADD, like attention deficit disorder.
It's pretty much the same thing.
But attention hyperactive disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorders, like I've never been really hyper. I do have a lot of energy, but I'm not ADHD. But on their test, I'm ADHD. So they suggested that I go on this non-narcotic Strattera ADHD medication. They're like, you can't take, you can't take controlled substances, man, because you'll abuse them. And so I was like, okay, but it was super expensive, and it's like, I didn't have any money. I wasn't making any money. I owed a lot of money to the state for court fines and restitutions and fucking lawyer fees. Like, I ain't trying to pay $115 a month for Strattera. Like, that ain't gonna help me. So this girl that was in recovery was like, oh, I have a prescription for Adderall. And I mean, I had snorted like thousands of milligrams of Adderall, so I knew everything about Adderall. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, that makes me really nervous. And she was like, well, I've got a prescription for Klonopin because I have anxiety. So even if you do get really nervous, you can just take some Klonopin. And I was like, okay, boom, Adderall, Klonopin. And like 2 or 3 days later, I made a call to that guy, and I was like, hey, man, I took Adderall and Klonopin. And I have ADHD and I have anxiety. And he's like, yeah, so what doctor, can you give me a name to a doctor that prescribed you those 2 medications? And I was like, no, it was Angie or whatever the girl's name was. Yeah, so that's a relapse, number 1. And number 2, like, that's against the law. So no, you got to start over. And I'm like, fuck. And I had enough like ambition to stay sober, and I saw enough people in those recovery groups that were like successful and seemed happy that I was like, okay, I gotta get back to these meeting things, and I gotta start hanging to these people. And so that's what I did. Like, I started back over. One thing I was suggested not to do is make any real major decisions in my first year of recovery. And that was by a bunch of different people in these groups, right? And so I didn't take that advice at all. And so I got into a relationship with a woman that I had nothing in connection with. So she was 34, I was 20. She was divorced. I had never really been in a healthy relationship other than I knew I loved Chelsea, my high school sweetheart, but she was gone. She left me. She was done with my ass. And now I'm newly sober, and I'm like, wow, maybe this will work. And it ended up being a purely sexual thing, and we had nothing in common. She had kids, she had a home, she had a little bit of money, and she was sober, and so maybe that's the only thing we had in common, but it was a horrible, sick, terrible relationship because I had no idea how to be a partner in a relationship. I had no idea how to be a friend. I had no idea how to do shit, man. I couldn't pay bills. I couldn't wash my clothes. I was a mess. But yet I thought I was capable of getting into a relationship with this lady. Well, 5.5 months later, I'm in Las Vegas at UFC 57, Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell 3, I think.
Dude, I was there. I was at that fight.
And I'm sitting in the back, and I had started training. I had trained in jiu-jitsu. I started training with some amateur boxers in Utah, in Ogden, Utah. I had competed in some boxing matches. I competed in a bunch of jiu-jitsu tournaments, and I was thinking about starting to compete in mixed martial arts, but I had a good base. CrossFit kind of just started at that time. It was like 2007. So there was a few affiliates here in Utah, and one of the guys I was training with was a former freestyle, national All-American, and he started doing CrossFit with this guy named Chris Spiller. And he was also a former wrestler, and he's a well-known CrossFitter here in Utah, in Park City, Utah. He's competed in the games. He's solid. And they were like, man, you should incorporate this anaerobic training with your MMA stuff. And I'm like, all right. And they offered me to get a level 1 certification, but I turned it down. And I was just like, okay. So I incorporated that training. I was doing all this stuff, but it's like in Las Vegas thinking, man, you know what? My dream's coming alive. I can start pursuing this career as a mixed martial artist. Things are great. Everything's good. I wasn't taking care of my lawyer fees, court fines, restitution. I wasn't focused on I was staying sober, but I wasn't doing what people in long-term recovery do. They were attending meetings. They were doing recovery stuff. They were learning to pray and meditate and stay sober one day at a time and focus on their insides, not the outsides. And here I am in a relationship with nobody I should be with. And I'm in Las Vegas, and she has a Diet Coke with lime, and I reach over to grab it, and she pulls it away from me. And I'm like, hey, I just wanted a drink real quick. I'm thirsty. And she's like, there's alcohol in this. And she was sober at the time. So I was like, what, you relapsed? Like, that was a big deal. And I had more time than I'd ever had before since starting the sobriety thing, which is 5.5 months. And I was like, well, shit. And I remember a conversation in there while they were fighting. And I was going for Randy Couture because he was a wrestler, you know, and Chuck ended up beating him. And I was like devastated. But the guy sitting next to me was like, hey, you look familiar. And I was like, oh, yeah, you've probably seen me around doing some fighting stuff. I said, I'll be out here in a couple years, which was total bullshit because I'd never fought yet. And like, there's no reason why he would have ever noticed me. You know, he was just probably drunk and trying to make conversation. And I was totally lying through my teeth. Oh yeah, you know, I train all the time, and you know, and like it was bullshit. But after that, we left, and we ended up going to the strip club, and she bought me a Long Island iced tea, and she slid the Long Island iced tea over to me, and I like looked at it, and I thought, man, this isn't a good idea, and I put it up to my lips, and then I set it down, and she was like, well, the alcohol touched your lips. That's pretty much a relapse, and I was like, yeah, you're right. Now, that's not her fault. That's my fault. And so I took a sip of that Long Island iced tea. And so just before having 6 months of continuous, absolute sobriety from all mind-altering substances, I took a sip of a Long Island iced tea. And like 4 days later, I ended up in Iowa with no pants on looking for meth. And I didn't get sober until April 16th, 2006, like 2.5 weeks later. I got home. I found out that girl had relapsed. She stole a bunch of jewelry from my parents. Like, and this girl had some money. She stole a bunch of jewelry from my parents. Like, she had, like, so I was in a relationship with her, but maybe she wasn't in a relationship with me. So she was, you know, she was stepping outside of the relationship, which, you know, so it was just bad. It was bad. And then my parents thought that I stole the jewelry and I had no idea about any of that. And I was just like, fuck my life, you know? And I got home and my parents, they thought I was sober, and then they found out I had relapsed. And they said, you got to be out of here tomorrow. And so I went, and they let me back in their house for a couple of days because I had nowhere to live. I was living with her. And I just was like, I can't do this anymore. And I had felony drug charges pending for the overdose, like second-degree felony, paraphernalia, and drug charges. And I had former criminal charges, inciting a riot, criminal mischief. I had multiple DUIs. I mean, I was just like, I'm going to go to prison. And I probably should go to prison. As a matter of fact, prison to me sounded like, okay, at least my parents will know I'm safe and I won't be harming anybody. I'll be in a goddamn cell where I can't fuck anything up because that's all I was good at doing. And I just went in my parents' house, and my dad, he drank Milwaukee's Best at the time, and he had to hide his beer in his closet. And so I like snuck to his room and like reached around the corner into his closet, like quietly slid the door open, and I pulled a Milwaukee's Best out, and like they didn't hear me. And then I walked downstairs, and I knew I was getting kicked out the next day, and I was just going to sit down and just drink that beer because I thought I deserved it. And I don't even remember if I cracked the beer open or not, but in my parents' house, you can hear somebody walk across. I mean, like, you got to get good at that, because when you're doing sneaky shit downstairs, you got to quit it when they're coming down the stairs, yeah. Right? So I heard that infamous sound of my dad walking across the kitchen floor, walking down the stairs, and I set the beer down. And I remember I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he said, "Son, I thought you weren't supposed to drink." And I looked at the clock, and it was like 1:30 in the morning, April 16th, 2006. And I'm like, I'm fucking done, man. and I put the beer down, and I didn't take a sip of it, and I was done. Like, that day I was done. It wasn't the felony charges. It wasn't all the shit that I'd been through, the girlfriend cheating, not like Chelsea moving away, losing the scholarship, losing the good job. Like, none of that shit. I was like, it was my dad. It was the disappointment in my dad's eyes. And one of the people I look up to most in my family is my grandfather. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was a pilot. He was just the most incredible guy to me in my life outside of my dad. And I just remember looking at him, and I had this vision of my grandpa just like with his big ass hands and his arms folded, like looking at me disappointed. So it was like my dad and my grandpa looking at me disappointed. And I just thought, I can't fucking do this anymore, man. I'm done. And I put the beer down, and that was it. That was 4,533 days ago. And I put that shit down, and I haven't picked up since.
My people, it's time to move out. Move out. My people, it's time to move out. Show 'em what we do now. They say that work seems so hard to follow. I am not a role model, only a teacher. Teach 'em